In this video, we'll be doing a basic overview of the PBR textures, which stands for physically based rendering. Now, before we talk about physically based rendering, we're going to quickly go over some of the older texture maps from, say, the 7th to early 8th gen systems. So, in the past, we used to create something called diffuse, specular, and normal. Diffuse maps were basically the surface materials of your object. So, for instance, if you had a wall, that would basically be the brick wall with, say, like the different decals on there. The specular map will basically determine how light reflects off that particular object. So if you had, say, a tiled wall, for instance, you'd see that some parts might be shiny. Adding some elements had a little bit of dirt to it to kind of compensate for how light reflects off that. And norm maps, which basically created the illusion of depth and higher detail. So for instance, you could emboss it with, say, words, or for instance have indents or extrusions in there to kind of add a higher level of detail to your particular object. Now, with the exception of normal maps, diffuse and specular maps have kind of become redundant and been replaced with what's known as physically based rendering. Now, physically based rendering, or PBR for short, is basically a realistic approach on how lighting reflects off your objects or materials, for instance. In the past, we've had to kind of guess how light would work off it by using these specular maps, but with PBR, it uses the real-time lighting to help reflect light off a object to make it look and appear much more realistic or even hyper-realistic. Now, there is a company out there called Algorithmic, which produce and sell software known as Substance Painter, which is an extremely useful tool because it basically allows you to import your 3D object and essentially paint on top of it using the PBR workflows. So you can create, say, your albedo, metallic, and even norm maps, for instance, using this software. It's pretty much the industry standard now to use PBR to create your textures. However, you can use, say, Photoshop to create your PBR textures as well, but Substance Painter is really the way to go, and you can download it for free as a student. You've got to sign up and download it, and there is some learning aspects to it as well that you can kind of check out. But right now we're going to quickly go over the basics of PBR. Now, on the website they do have 2 volumes. Volume 1 goes over the science of light, which would be worth reading through as well, but this is more the sort of practical elements to it. So there are 2 different workflows. There's metal roughness and specular glossiness. Now, we're going to focus on the metallic workflow, mainly because game engines such as Unity and Unreal 4, they stick towards this particular pipeline here, as opposed to, say, the specular one. So we'll quickly start off with the first texture map which you have, which is known as the base color or albedo map. Essentially, it's just the surface material of your objects. So, for example, say like the tiles, brick walls, wood, for instance. However, the key difference between the base color and, say, a diffuse map is that the base color / albedo map is completely devoid of any light whatsoever. As you can see, there's no real indication of how light bounces off this red here. That's because the PBR shaders will calculate how light reacts off that object itself. So when you create something in Photoshop that is going to be your albedo / base color map, you need to make sure that you remove any indication of light whatsoever. So for instance, if some area is a little bit darker because of the lighting of from the camera or some shadowing there, that needs to be completely taken out. The next map we have is the metallic map, which basically indicates with a grayscale of if this particular part of the object is metal or if it's not metal. So white represents pure metal, black meaning that it's not metal whatsoever, and the greys can kind of compensate for anything such as like oxidization, like say for example rusting, or kind of like say dirt on your metal, for instance, or maybe that it's not a very reflective piece of metal, so it'll be kind of more like greyish. So it's important to remember that your metallic maps will work in a grayscale. So again, you can see here that you've got some pure white there, which showcases on the actual model itself, which showcases that, yeah, this is a pure piece of brass, silver, gold, aluminium, whatever it may be. However, if you look at the painted side here, it wouldn't really be reflective because again, it's painted over, and there's some chips here which kind of exposes the raw metal there. And there's some grey areas here, again, to kind of compensate for, say, the dirt, for instance. And the last one that we have is the roughness map, which basically describes, as it says here, surface irregularities that causes light diffusion. So basically, it's the smaller elements that you would find. So for example, if you had a tiled wall and tiled floor, for instance, if you put your hands on it, or if you're walking around with it, saying with your shoes on, as light reflects off it, you can kind of see those imprints. So for example, little scratches here and there, say thumbprints, fingerprints, any sort of small little increments of dirt. You'll create that using the roughness map to kind of add in those sort of higher amounts of details. And it's really good as an artist to add these in, because again, it kind of tells a little bit of a story with your object. So it must have gone through a bit of hell if it's going to be like really, it's got a lot of dirt or scratch marks on it. And again, you wouldn't put those in your base color / albedo map. You put them in the roughness, because as the light bounces off it, it kind of showcases those little bits of detail, which really brings your 3D model to life. And it does work in grayscale as well. So as you can see here, black represents a smooth surface, white represents rough surfaces, and as you can see, the in-betweens are kind of more like, it is kind of smooth, but although it might just be rough enough. So you can kind of see here, you have a little bit of, say, a thumbprint mark here, slight little scratches or just dirt here and there, which really brings to life the 3D model. And I'll quickly show an example of how PBR is used by going to ArtStation. So here we are in ArtStation, which is a website where artists upload their work, whether it be 3D models or concept art. Now, this is a 3D model from Oddworld New and Tasty, which uses the PBR workflow. Now, I don't think it uses specifically the metallic roughness one. I think it does use the specular gloss one, but it is a good example of how PBR works in real time. This is using a Marmoset tool bag as well, and it's from a guy named Thomas Bramall. So we can see here that this is the albedo map, and you can see here right now, with the legs, for instance, especially with the skin as well, that there's no real light information whatsoever. Again, that's because all the light will come from the shader itself, how it's bouncing off, say, the light within, say, the game engine, or within, say, Marmoset right now, for instance. But if we go to, say, the reflectivity, which would kind of act as, say, the metallic, if you're going for the metal workflow, you can see that the skin, these areas here are pretty much almost completely black, because again, you wouldn't really there's no real metal within the skin itself, and this is kind of more like rubber, for instance. But if you look at the legs, for instance, you can see here that there is a lot of really nice detail that's added on here, which again we can use the metallic and even the roughness maps to create. So you have this sort of like nice sort of dirt and grime, some scratches here and there, which when it's all put together, you can see that you've got a nice sort of metal here, but as you move around it, you can see how the textures really kind of light up and bring this model to life using PBR workflows. And hopefully you guys should be able to create something very similar as well. So in the next series of videos, we'll be going through each texture map. We'll go through the albedo first, move on to, say, the metallic, roughness, normal maps, and then putting it all together in Maya.